In 1917, the future dictator of Korea, Park Chung-hee, was born into a poor family in the countryside of Gumi, in Japanese-occupied Korea. Following the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the ambitious Park decided to enter the Changchun Military Academy of the Manchukuo Imperial Army. During this time, he even adopted the Japanese name Takagi Masao. After graduating third in the class of 1944 at age of 27, Park Chung-hee was commissioned as a lieutenant into the Imperial Army of Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state, and served as a Korean collaborator with the Japanese. In 1946, Park Chung-hee returned to Korea after the war had ended and enrolled at the Korea Military Academy. One of his classmates was Kim Jae-gyu, his close friend. Park became an officer in the Constabulary Army, which would later become the ROK Army, under the USA MGIK. In 1948, the new South Korean government under Syngman Rhee arrested Park Chung-hee on charges that he led a communist cell in the Korean Constabulary. Park was subsequently sentenced to death by a military court, but his sentence was commuted by Syngman Rhee at the urging of several high-ranking Korean military officers. In 1950, when the Korean War began, Park returned to active service as a major in the South Korean Army. In the same year, Park married Yuk Yong-soo, the daughter of a prosperous landlord. Yuk's father was against the marriage of his prestigious daughter with a poor man from the countryside, and so she married without her father's blessing. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953, Park had already become a brigadier general in the army. On the 26th of April 1960, Syngman Rhee, the inaugural president of South Korea, was forced into exile following the 19 April movement, a student-led uprising. A new democratic government under Yoon Bo-seon took office on 13th of August 1960. However, this was a short-lived period of parliamentary rule in South Korea, as the young and fledgling government was caught between an economy that was suffering from a decade of mismanagement under the Rhee presidency and the protesting students who had instigated Rhee's ousting. During this period, protesters regularly filled the streets, making numerous demands for political and economic reforms. Against this backdrop of social instability and division, Major General Park led a military coup on 16th of May 1961, ending all hopes of the democratically elected government of President Yoon. After the coup, Park formed a committee known as the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, acting as a military junta government and de facto ruler of South Korea. Despite rising to power by a coup, the military council decided to create the Korean Central Intelligence Agency in order to prevent further coups and counter-coups. In 1961, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung secretly sent Hwang Tae-song, a former friend of Park Chung-hee and a vice minister in the North Korean Ministry of Trade, to South Korea, hoping to improve inter-Korean relations. However, in order to dissipate the suspicions about his communist leanings and assure the Americans his firm stance as an ally, Park decided to execute his old friend Hwang as a spy. Later that year, Park promoted himself to Lieutenant General and in 1962 promoted himself to a full general. In 1963, Park hung up his military fatigues and ran for election as a civilian candidate of his newly created political party, the Democratic Republican Party. This was likely done not out of idealism to emulate the first US President George Washington, but because of pressure from President Kennedy to democratize and hold free elections. Ultimately, Park won the election by a narrow 1.5% margin, becoming the de jure leader of South Korea. From 1964 to 1973, Park sent an average of 50,000 soldiers per year to fight with the Americans in Vietnam. South Korea's troops in Vietnam totaled some 320,000, contributing troops to Vietnam only second to the US itself. Park was eager to send South Korean troops to Vietnam and vigorously campaigned to extend the war because South Korean soldiers were paid by the United States federal government and their salaries were remitted directly to the South Korean government. In addition, Park's administration received tens of billions of dollars in grants, loans, subsidies, technological transfers, and preferential markets, all provided by the Johnson and Nixon administrations. Such economical aid exchanged with the blood of South Koreans undeniably helped boost the South Korea's economy. When Park came to power in 1961, South Korea's per capita income was only $72. North Korea was the greater economic and military power on the peninsula due to the North's history of heavy industries. One of Park's reforms was to bring in 24-hour provision of electricity in 1964, which was a major change. With the 5-year plan in 1967, Park launched the Kuro Industrial Park in southwestern Seoul and created the state-owned Pohang in Iron and Steel Company Limited to provide cheap steel for the chaebol, who were founding the first automobile factories and shipyards in South Korea. The Park government rewarded chaebols who met their targets under the 5-year plans with loans on easy terms of repayment, tax cuts, easy licensing, and subsidies. Hyundai, which began as a transport firm moving supplies for the US Army during the Korean War, came to dominate the South Korean construction industry in the 1960s and in 1967 opened its first car factory. Hyundai moved into shipbuilding, cement, chemicals, and electronics, ultimately becoming one of the world's largest corporations. A sign of the growth of the South Korean economy was that in 1969, there were 200,000 television sets in operation in South Korea. And by 1979, there were 6 million television sets operating in South Korea. Later in 1970, Park launched his Semo Undong policy that set out to modernize the countryside by providing electricity and running water to farmers, building paved roads, and replacing thatched roofs with tin roofs. In 1979, the per capita GDP of South Korea was $1,780. In 18 years from 1961 to 1979, the GDP per capita of South Korea increased by 24 times. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and comment below so we can produce similar videos in the future.